Right now, across Europe, governments are legally using a 1955 colonial war law, a 2020 virus, and, well, the concept of fear-mongering to justify searching homes without warrants
Right.
and ruling by decree
Right.
and just quietly dismantling the fundamental rights of their citizens in 2024. And, the most shocking part isn't even that this is happening.
No, it's that it's entirely legal.
Exactly. Technically, 100% legal.
Yeah, I mean, it is the ultimate systemic loophole. We are watching the architecture of liberal democracy being rewired from the inside out, and not by, military force, but through administrative paperwork.
Paperwork and incredibly vague legal definitions.
Exactly.
So welcome to this deep dive. We have a very specific and frankly urgent mission today. We're going to take you, the listener, on an investigative journey to uncover what amounts to a massive, continent-wide political and legal scandal.
He really is.
We're basically conducting an autopsy here, but not of a physical body. This is an autopsy of a concept, the rule of law itself.
And the crime, so to speak, happened in broad daylight.
Right. Hidden right there in the fine print of parliamentary bills and supranational treaties. And the victims, the public, you, me, we barely even noticed the shift.
Because it happens so incrementally.
Exactly. So today, we're focusing on two highly dangerous phenomena, the Ratchet effect and emergency creep.
Right, and these aren't just, academic buzzwords. They describe a very real, verifiable, documented process. It's where the state utilizes moments of severe, genuine crisis to systematically expand its own power.
And crucially, and this is the key point, when the crisis inevitably subsides, that expanded power does not.
No, it doesn't. The state just retains it. They embed that emergency authority into everyday, ordinary law.
To build this case today, we've pulled together a towering stack of evidence. And I want to be clear, we aren't looking at opinion pieces here.
No, we're looking at hard legal analyses.
Right. Constitutional reviews and exhaustive reports from some of the most respected human rights and legal organizations in the world.
Organizations like the International Commission of Jurists.
Yes. And the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, which goes by PICUM, as well as peer-reviewed academic journals like the European Journal of Risk Regulation.
And constitutional studies from the Max Planck Institute. I mean, the material we are synthesizing today is dense. It is heavily footnoted.
Very heavily footnoted.
Yeah, and it tracks the subtle mechanical changes in statutory law over the last decade. We're looking directly at the primary source texts of the laws themselves.
The amendments, the rulings of the highest courts in Europe that have, tried and often failed to rein this in. But before we open the first file, I need to issue a very clear, very firm disclaimer to you listening.
This is important, yeah.
The sources we're exploring today touch on highly, highly politically charged events. We're going to be talking about the governance styles of both left-wing and right-wing administrations.
And incredibly sensitive topics.
Right. Mass migration, global terrorism, the war in Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic. So I want to explicitly remind you that we are not endorsing any political viewpoints today.
No, absolutely not.
We are not taking sides on the partisan spectrum. Our role here is purely analytical and impartial.
We are operating as basically forensic accountants of the law.
I like that. Forensic accountants.
Right. Our goal is to impartially report on the content provided in these reports and convey the structural constitutional changes detailed in the source material. We are dissecting the mechanisms of power, not debating the ideological justifications behind them.
Spot on. So our roadmap for this autopsy involves three distinct smoking guns. First, we'll examine France's SELT law. Second, we'll look at Hungary's Enabling Act.
And finally, we will elevate this to the supranational level and investigate the European Union's 2024 Schengen Borders Code reform.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we visit the specific crime scenes, we really need to establish the modus operandi. How exactly do modern constitutional governments legally justify stealing power from the legislature and the judiciary?
What's the baseline rule they're twisting, right?
Exactly. What is that baseline?
Well, to understand the manipulation, we first have to understand the baseline rule of international human rights law. The foundational framework in Europe is the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR.
Okay.
And the pivot point for our entire investigation today is Article 15 of that convention.
Article 15, the emergency ripcord. Let's break down exactly what this article says and, honestly, why it exists in the first place. Because it was drafted right in the aftermath of World War II, correct?
Yeah, that context is vital. The drafters of the ECHR had just witnessed the complete collapse of democratic systems across Europe.
Right, they lived through it.
They knew that a constitution is frankly, just a piece of paper if it cannot survive a genuine existential threat. So Article 15 was designed as a safety valve. It explicitly allows contracting states to derogate meaning to temporarily suspend or opt out of certain fundamental rights guaranteed by the convention.
But they didn't just write a blank check for governments to use whenever they felt like it.
Oh, no, not at all.
The wording in the sources highlights a very specific threshold. A government can only pull this ripcord in time of war or other public emergency, threatening the life of the nation.
That phrase is crucial.
Threatening the life of the nation. That carries a massive legal burden. It doesn't mean a bad recession. It doesn't mean, a severe winter storm or a localized political scandal.
Exactly. And the jurisprudence from the European Court of Human Rights, the ECTHR, has spent decades strictly defining those parameters. If we look at foundational cases like the Lawless v. Ireland case in 1961.
Oh, right. I read about that one in the file.
Yeah, or the Greek case in 1969, the court established a really rigorous multi-part test. The emergency must be actual or absolutely imminent. It cannot be hypothetical.
It has to be happening right now.
Right now. Furthermore, its effects must involve the whole nation. It must threaten the continuance of the organized life of the community. And the crisis must be so exceptional that the normal measures permitted by the convention are demonstrably, plainly inadequate.
Meaning, the state has to prove that the regular police, the regular courts, and the regular laws are fundamentally incapable of stopping the country from collapsing.
Yes.
Only then can they temporarily suspend certain rights. And even then, there are absolute hard limits, right? You can never suspend the right to life or the prohibition of torture or slavery.
Never. Those are absolute. Furthermore, any emergency measure taken must be, in the court's words, strictly required by the exigencies of the situation. It has to be proportional.
You can't declare martial law to deal with a localized riot.
Exactly. In theory, this is a beautifully balanced system. An emergency power is conceptualized as a temporary, highly regulated suspension of the legal order, designed specifically to save that legal order so it can eventually return to normalcy.
Right. That is the textbook definition. But the massive stack of evidence from the Max Planck Institute and the ICJ suggests that this textbook has basically been thrown out the window.
Completely thrown out.
We aren't looking at temporary suspensions anymore, are we?
No. What's fascinating here is the theoretical shift identified by legal scholars. We've moved away from the classical model of the temporary exception and entered an era of authoritarian legality.
Authoritarian legality.
Or what French administrative scholars term légalité élargie, which translates to expanded legality.
Expanded legality.
Yeah, in this new paradigm, the exception ceases to be exceptional. It becomes the structural foundation of the state.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of how a state transitions from a temporary emergency to this expanded legality. Because it clearly doesn't happen in a single dramatic televised broadcast where a dictator seizes the microphone.
Right, there's no dramatic movie villain moment.
Exactly. It happens through this mechanism the academic journals call the Ratchet effect. Walk me through the physics of this political ratchet.
Well, a literal ratchet is a mechanical gear with teeth and a pawl. It's designed to allow continuous motion in only one direction while completely preventing motion in the opposite direction.
It only turns one way.
Right. And the academic literature, particularly citing theorists who study the sociology of law, applies this perfectly to executive power. During a massive crisis, the executive branch demands, and is usually granted, expanded powers to deal with the threat. The gear turns forward.
I picture it like a heavy-duty rubber band.
Okay, like that.
You have a massive stack of chaotic files, that's the crisis, and you stretch this rubber band way past its intended limit to hold everything together.
Yeah.
The public accepts this because, well, the files need to be secured.
Sure.
But here is the critical part. When the crisis is over and you take the files away, that rubber band doesn't snap back to its original tight shape. The elasticity is destroyed. It is permanently warped.
Yep.
The government keeps a little bit of that extra slack, that extra authority.
Your analogy captures the structural degradation perfectly. Think about it. When you're a government minister, a police prefect, or an intelligence director operating with fewer legislative restraints and less judicial oversight, your job is objectively easier.
Well, yeah, nobody's looking over your shoulder.
Exactly. You can execute decisions rapidly.
Okay.
You face significantly less bureaucratic friction. Human nature dictates that when the crisis abates, the administration is highly incentivized to rationalize keeping those convenient tools. They simply redefine the new expanded state as the baseline.
I have to push back on this, though. We live in democracies. We have elections, we have a free press, we have civil liberties groups.
We do.
If a government announced, hey, the war is over, but we really enjoyed the power to search your homes without a warrant, so we're just going to keep it, the public would be in the streets.
Yeah.
How does the administration warp the rubber band without triggering a massive societal immune response?
They do it through a very specific psychological and legal strategy outlined in the sources. It's called crissification.
Crissification.
Yeah.
Meaning the manufacturing or sustaining of a crisis state.
Exactly. It is the process of keeping the public in a state of constant, overlapping, and seemingly perpetual emergencies.
Wow.
If the threat of global terrorism begins to wane in the public consciousness, well, a global pandemic arrives. As the pandemic begins to recede, a massive land war erupts in a neighboring region, sparking an energy and migration crisis.
It's just crisis after crisis.
By stacking these crises one on top of the other, the state of emergency becomes the baseline cognitive reality for the electorate.
It's societal exhaustion. I mean, if I'm constantly terrified about my health, my physical safety, or the economic collapse of my country, I'm fundamentally less likely to care about the abstract concept of judicial oversight.
Exactly.
I'm not going to question the firefighter who demands the keys to my house if I believe the neighborhood is perpetually on fire.
That psychological conditioning provides the political cover for the legal maneuvers. And to see how crissification actually rewires a legal system in real time, we don't have to look at a theoretical model. We can look at a nation that experienced a massive, undeniable shock.
And watch exactly how the administrative state absorbed those shock waves and basically never let them go. Let's pull the file on France, which serves as our Exhibit A.
Okay.
I call this file The Illusion of Normalcy. To understand the legal autopsy of France, we have to ground ourselves in the sheer trauma of the inciting incident. The date is November 13, 2015.
The Paris terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
Coordinated assaults on the Bataclan Theater, the Stade de France, and several cafes. 130 people murdered, hundreds more severely injured. It was an event that shook the foundation of the French Republic.
It was horrifying, and the immediate visceral response of the French state was to declare a state of emergency. Given the parameters of Article 15 we just discussed, a coordinated terrorist attack in the capital city absolutely qualifies as a threat to the life of the nation.
Without a doubt.
But as I was reading through the source material from the legal scholars analyzing this period, a completely bizarre historical detail jumped out at me. The legal foundation they used to declare this 2015 emergency wasn't some modern 21st century counterterrorism statute.
No, it wasn't.
They resurrected a law from 1955.
The Law of 3 April 1955. This is where the structural anomaly begins. We have to look at what France was dealing with back in 1955. They were entrenched in the colonial Algerian War.
Right.
This specific piece of legislation was explicitly drafted to maintain brutal public order and crush violent insurrection in a colonial territory. It was, for all intents and purposes, a martial law adjacent framework designed for asymmetric warfare.
Wait, hold on. A law designed to suppress an anti-colonial uprising in North Africa in the 1950s is suddenly applied to the streets of modern Paris in 2015.
Yes.
Between the end of the Algerian War in 1962 and the Paris attacks, how often had this drastic tool even been utilized?
Almost never. The sources note it had been activated only twice in over half a century. Once in the overseas territory of New Caledonia in 1984, and briefly during the Paris suburban riots in 2005. It was a dusty, extreme relic.
And under the French constitutional framework, this specific state of emergency is supposed to be incredibly short-lived, right? Like, the executive branch can declare it, but it's only meant to last for 12 days.
Right, 12 days. After that shock absorber period, the president has to go to Parliament, present the evidence, and beg the legislature for an extension.
That is the democratic safeguard. The executive can act swiftly to stop the bleeding, but the legislature must oversee the ongoing treatment. However, the documentation shows that the 2015 state of emergency was not a brief pause. It was extended by Parliament 6 consecutive times.
6 times. It lasted for 2 solid years, officially ending in November 2017.
2 years of living under colonial-era emergency rules in one of the most developed democracies on Earth. We need to drill down into what those rules actually allowed the state to do, Because state of emergency sounds a bit abstract.
It does, but the reality was very concrete.
Right, the sources highlight 4 specific extreme police powers that were unleashed during this 24-month period. Let's lay them out.
Okay, so the 4 core powers granted to the administrative authorities, specifically the regional prefects and the Ministry of the Interior, were as follows. First, the power to conduct administrative searches of homes and businesses without a warrant.
Without a warrant.
Okay. Second, the authority to proactively ban or violently disperse public demonstrations.
Wow.
Third, the ability to place individuals under strict house arrest or mandate daily check-ins at police stations. And fourth, the unilateral power to order the closure of places of worship.
I want to focus intensely on that first power, the warrantless search. Let's explain why this is such a profound violation of normal democratic functioning. In a standard, functional rule of law system, if the police suspect I'm building a bomb in my garage, they cannot just kick my door down.
No, absolutely not.
They have to compile evidence, take that evidence to an independent judge, and convince that judge that there is probable cause. The judge acts as the neutral referee between the power of the state and the privacy of the citizen.
Exactly. The judicial warrant is the absolute cornerstone of criminal law. Under the 1955 emergency framework, the executive branch completely bypassed that neutral referee.
Completely bypass them.
A regional prefect could order heavily armed police to raid a home in the middle of the night based entirely on administrative suspicion, often relying on classified intelligence that was never scrutinized by a magistrate prior to the raid.
So, for 2 years, the French public lives with this reality. Homes are raided, protests are banned, mosques are closed. Predictably, human rights organizations, legal scholars, and eventually the public begin to apply immense pressure. You cannot run a liberal democracy under martial law light forever.
Right. The crucifixion strategy starts to wear thin.
So in the fall of 2017, the administration under President Emmanuel Macron makes a grand announcement. They declare, "We hear you. The immediate crisis is past. We are officially lifting the state of emergency."
Right. On paper, the state of emergency ended, but this is the exact moment the Ratchet effect engaged its teeth. They didn't return to the pre-2015 legal baseline.
Not at all.
Instead, the government passed a massive piece of legislation known as the SILT law, the law for strengthening internal security and the fight against terrorism, in October 2017.
I spent hours looking at the analysis of the SILT law in our sources. It is one of the most cynical pieces of legislative drafting I have ever seen. Because instead of ending the emergency powers, the parliament simply took those exact same colonial-era powers, deleted the word emergency from the top of the page, and wrote ordinary security code.
That's essentially what happened.
How does a democratic parliament legally justify making a state of emergency permanent?
Well, they utilize the tactic of semantic repackaging. The legal scholars point out that the government knew they couldn't just copy and paste the 1955 law directly. It would be too obvious.
Right.
So they took the 4 core powers and subtly altered the vocabulary to make them sound administrative and bureaucratic rather than militaristic.
Give me the translation. How do they rebrand a warrantless police raid?
Warrantless searches were rebranded in the SILT law as home visits.
Home visits. That is chilling. That sounds like a social worker dropping by with a pamphlet, not a tactical police unit executing a raid without judicial prior approval.
What about house arrest? House arrest was repackaged as individual measures of administrative control and surveillance.
Just a mouthful of bureaucracy.
Exactly. But the powers remained functionally identical. The prefect could still restrict your movement, force you to wear an electronic bracelet, or ban you from leaving your municipality.
This is the essence of expanded legality. But the sources emphasize a deeper, much more dangerous structural shift happening beneath the vocabulary. It's the shift from criminal law to administrative law. I need you to break down why this specific shift is the actual death knell for civil liberties.
This is really the crux of the legal autopsy here. Criminal law is inherently retrospective. It deals with a post-crime reality. A crime occurs, an investigation gathers evidence, a prosecutor brings charges, and a judge presides over a trial to determine guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right. The whole system is built around the presumption of innocence and protecting the accused.
Exactly. Administrative law, however, is entirely different. Administrative law governs the operation of government agencies. And when you move counterterrorism into administrative law, you fundamentally shift to a pre-crime logic.
Pre-crime. It sounds like science fiction, like Minority Report. You're punishing people for things they haven't done yet.
Yes. The administrative goal is prevention, not prosecution. Therefore, under SILT, the Ministry of the Interior doesn't need to prove you actually committed a crime. They only need to suspect, based on incredibly vague administrative criteria, that your behavior, your social associations, or your religious practices might pose a threat to public order in the future.
So they act on the suspicion of future behavior, completely sidelining the independent judiciary.
Completely. The judge is no longer the gatekeeper. The judge is relegated to reviewing the administrative action only after your door has been kicked in or your business has been shut down.
And the sources provide deeply disturbing evidence of how this pre-crime logic manifests in reality. Because when you grant police broad discretionary power based on vague suspicion rather than concrete evidence, human bias inevitably fills the void.
It always does.
The reports from human rights observers clearly document that the SILT law and the emergency measures that preceded it disproportionately targeted the Muslim community in France.
The targeting was systemic. The administrative criteria for what constituted a threat were incredibly porous. The sources detail how closures of places of worship and administrative control measures were frequently based on what they call notes blanches, or white notes.
Explain the white notes, because this genuinely shocked me when I read it.
A white note is an intelligence summary produced by the domestic security services. But crucially, it is unsigned, it is often undated, and it rarely reveals its sources or methods.
It's just a blank sheet of paper with accusations on it.
It is essentially an anonymous memo of suspicion. Under the administrative framework of SILT, a prefect can use a white note to justify shutting down a mosque or placing an individual under surveillance.
And if the targeted individual tries to appeal the decision in an administrative court,
well, their lawyer is essentially trying to cross-examine a blank piece of paper. You cannot challenge the evidence because the evidence is classified and anonymous.
it is a Kafkaesque nightmare. You are restricted based on a secret memo, and the judge reviewing it just defers to the executive's claim of national security. The sociological researchers cited in our files use a very specific medical term to describe the ultimate outcome of this targeting: iatrogenic radicalization.
Yes.
I knew iatrogenic from medicine. It means an illness caused by the medical examination or treatment itself, like an infection you get during surgery.
Right, and applying that medical concept to state security is profound. The warning from sociologists is that the state is acting as the pathogen. By legally alienating an entire demographic, by subjecting innocent individuals to home visits, and surveillance based purely on religious profiling and anonymous white notes, the state inflicts deep societal trauma.
The treatment actually causes the disease.
Exactly. The draconian administrative powers of SILT actually foster the feelings of marginalization, humiliation, and disenfranchisement that are the primary drivers of radicalization. The state risks manufacturing the very disease it claims to be eradicating.
And just to prove how permanent the Ratchet effect is, we have to look at the final legislative maneuver. When Macron's government passed SILT in 2017, they faced some pushback. So, to pacify the critics, they included a sunset clause.
Ah, yes, the sunset clause.
They promised, hey, these measures will automatically expire on July 31st, 2021. It's just a temporary bridge.
And we know how governments treat sunset clauses on executive power. On July 30, 2021, literally the day before the powers were set to expire, a new bill was signed into law.
It didn't just extend SILT. It permanently codified the measures into common law. And they even expanded the powers. The government granted themselves the authority to not just close a place of worship, but to administratively close any adjoining spaces or businesses affiliated with it.
So the rubber band is completely severed from its original shape. The state of exception is the daily reality of French administrative law. The tools forged for the Algerian War are now the standard operating procedure for policing in the 21st century.
France's approach was insidious. It was a creeping bureaucratic integration of emergency law achieved by swapping out the vocabulary. But what happens when a government doesn't even bother to play games with vocabulary?
Then you get our second case study.
Right. What happens when a government uses an emergency not just to expand police powers, but to actively, aggressively dismantle the entire constitutional order? To see the Ratchet effect in its most naked, aggressive form, we have to pull the file on Exhibit B. We have to look at Hungary and the architecture of the endless crisis.
If France represents administrative emergency creep, Hungary is the definitive masterclass in constitutional weaponization. To dissect Hungary, we have to start with their baseline. The fundamental law, which is their constitution, adopted in 2011 under Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's Fidesz party.
Reading through the constitutional analysis in our sources, the Hungarian framework for emergencies seems incredibly, almost needlessly complex. They don't just have one catch-all state of emergency.
Well, they have a whole menu.
Yeah. The 2011 Constitution established 6 different special legal orders. They had a state of national crisis, a state of emergency, a state of preventive defense, a state of terrorist threat, a state of unexpected attack, and a state of danger. Why create such a fractured system?
By creating highly specific, varied categories of emergencies, the executive branch basically gave itself multiple different keys to bypass normal democratic procedure. It allows the government to constantly shift the legal justification depending on the news cycle. And the execution of this strategy didn't begin with the pandemic. The timeline in our sources clearly shows the Hungarian Ratchet effect began in 2015.
2015 again. The exact same year France invoked its emergency, but a totally different inciting incident. France was terrorism. Hungary utilized the European migration crisis.
Correct. In September 2015, faced with an influx of refugees and migrants moving through Europe, the Hungarian government introduced a new statutory category, the crisis situation caused by mass immigration.
Right.
They used this declaration to grant themselves sweeping powers to deploy the military to the borders and fundamentally alter asylum procedures.
Now look, a sudden massive movement of people across a border undeniably requires a logistical response. I think anyone would agree with that. But the data in the reports from the Hungarian Helsinki Committee reveals an astonishing fact. This specific crisis situation declared in September 2015 has been legally renewed by the government every single 6 months for almost 9 years. We are approaching a decade of this specific legal crisis.
And the objective reality completely contradicts the legal reality. The numbers of asylum applications in Hungary plummeted years ago. They are drastically, almost statistically insignificantly low.
So the crisis is over.
The material cause of the crisis evaporated, but the legal architecture of the crisis remains entirely active.
Under the guise of this endless phantom migration crisis, what powers has the executive maintained?
Well, the government essentially suspended the fundamental right to apply for asylum within Hungarian territory. They legalized collective expulsions, what human rights groups call pushbacks, which the Court of Justice of the European Union explicitly ruled violates international law.
Wow.
Furthermore, they granted military forces extensive policing powers, including the right to bear arms in border protection scenarios involving civilians. They basically created a permanent militarized exclusion zone based on a statistical ghost.
So they successfully test drove the endless crisis. They proved to themselves that they could maintain a special legal order indefinitely without facing any serious domestic rebellion. They set the stage perfectly. And then the ultimate opportunity arrived, March 2020.
The COVID-19 pandemic hits.
An undeniable global biological emergency.
This brings us to the centerpiece of the Hungarian file. The Authorization Act, widely referred to globally as the Enabling Act. In March 2020, the government utilized that menu of constitutional options and declared a state of danger due to a human epidemic.
Now, I want to be fair here. Every single nation on Earth declared some form of emergency in March 2020.
Of course.
You had to declare an emergency to mandate lockdowns, close borders, and allocate emergency health funding. What made the Hungarian Enabling Act uniquely destructive?
2 critical factors isolated the Hungarian response from other democracies. First, the sheer unchecked scope of the power. The Enabling Act granted the executive branch a carte blanche mandate to suspend the application of existing acts of parliament, deviate from statutory provisions, and introduce extraordinary measures solely via executive decree.
So the prime minister could effectively legislate from his desk.
Exactly. Second, and vastly more terrifying, the law contained no sunset clause.
No sunset clause. Let's pause and emphasize that.
Yep.
They passed a law granting the prime minister the unilateral power to rule by decree, to override the elected parliament, and they intentionally left out an expiration date.
Not at all.
It wasn't for 30 days, it wasn't for 90 days, it was totally open-ended.
The government argued that the parliament, which it must be noted was completely dominated by the ruling Fidesz party's 2/3 supermajority, technically retained the power to revoke the authorization at any time.
Yeah, sure.
But legally and practically, it was a blank check. The executive branch became the sole, uncontested arbiter of determining when the pandemic would officially end.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look at what they actually did with this limitless power. I mean, did they utilize these decrees purely to procure ventilators, build field hospitals, and manage the health infrastructure?
Well, the quantitative data tracked by legal observers is staggering. Since the initial declaration in March 2020, the Hungarian government has issued over 1,000 emergency decrees.
1,000.
Think about the volume of that. Over 1,000 times, the executive bypassed the democratic legislative process to create immediate law. But it is the qualitative analysis of those decrees that reveals the true autopsy of Hungarian democracy.
Because the research explicitly documents that over 100 of these emergency decrees had absolutely zero connection to public health, the pandemic, or the virus.
Nothing whatsoever. The Hungarian Helsinki Committee meticulously categorized these decrees. The government actively weaponized the pandemic emergency powers to systematically defund political opponents, restrict civic space, and aggressively alter the fundamental rights of marginalized citizens.
Give me the concrete examples. Let's look at the actual decrees. How did they use a virus to defund political opponents?
Through a highly targeted decree, the central government unilaterally stripped opposition-led municipalities of significant tax revenues, specifically vehicle taxes.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Under the guise of redirecting funds to a pandemic defense fund, they systematically starved local opposition mayors of the budget required to function, thereby centralizing power in the capital.
That is a surgical political strike disguised as public health management. What about the press? How did they use the decrees to control the narrative?
They issued a decree altering the Freedom of Information Act. Normally, public institutions had 15 days to respond to data requests from journalists. The emergency decree tripled that deadline to 45 days.
So it takes longer to get info.
But wait, it also allowed institutions to extend it by another 45 days if they claimed responding would hinder pandemic defense.
Oh, wow.
In practice, they created a 90-day blackout window, making it virtually impossible for investigative journalists to report accurately on the government's handling of the crisis in real time.
Imagine trying to use a software update on your computer. You click Update because you're told it will fix a security virus. But while the screen is loading, the update quietly rewrites your administrative privileges, changes the passwords to your bank accounts, and locks you out of the hard drive.
That's a great way to put it.
That is what the Enabling Act did to the Hungarian constitution. But the absolute peak of this legislative abuse occurred in December 2020, didn't it?
Yes, right in the brutal middle of the second wave of COVID-19, while the public was locked down, terrified, and focused entirely on survival, the government utilized its two-thirds majority to push through the Ninth Amendment to the fundamental law.
And what did this constitutional amendment passed during a respiratory pandemic actually do?
It was a sweeping ideological package. Among other deeply controversial elements, it severely targeted LGBTQ+ rights, cementing a highly restrictive definition of family and marriage into the Constitution, explicitly stating that the mother is a woman, the father is a man.
During a pandemic.
Furthermore, in the same period, they altered electoral legislation, specifically changing the rules on how national party lists are formed, mathematically making it significantly harder for fractured opposition parties to form a unified coalition against the ruling party.
I'm struggling to find the words. How on earth does an administration look the public in the eye and justify rewriting electoral coalition math and redefining marriage as a necessary measure to combat a highly contagious virus?
They don't have to justify it. That is the dark magic of Chrisification. You utilize the fog of the crisis, the sensory overload of the public, and the total suspension of meaningful parliamentary debate to ram through ideological objectives that would normally face massive societal resistance. The report from the International Commission of Jurists leaves no room for ambiguity. They explicitly state that the response to COVID-19 in Hungary evidenced a calculated attack on the independence of the judiciary, freedom of expression, and the democratic process itself.
Okay, but the timeline eventually catches up with them. Vaccines are developed. The death rates drop. By mid-2022, the pandemic has definitively waned globally. Even the most aggressive executive has to eventually admit that COVID is no longer an acute emergency. They have to give the blank check back, right?
This brings us to the ultimate cynical evolution of the Ratchet effect. We move from Chrisification to what we can call the shell game of crises.
Keep your eye on the emergency. Which cup is the state of danger hiding under today?
Exactly. The government realized their primary justification for ruling by decree was evaporating. If the pandemic ends, the decrees end. So they changed the rules of the game again. Remember the Ninth Amendment we just discussed. Alongside the ideological changes, it also simplified the special legal orders from 6 categories down to 3: state of war, state of emergency, and state of danger. But then, in May 2022, they passed the 10th Amendment.
Why a 10th Amendment? What specific wording did they change?
They vastly expanded the definition of a state of danger. Previously, a state of danger was strictly limited to natural disasters or major industrial accidents like a chemical spill. The 10th Amendment altered the Constitution to allow the government to declare a state of danger in the event of an armed conflict, war situation, or humanitarian catastrophe in a neighboring country.
A neighboring country. Russia invades Ukraine in February 2022. Hungary shares a border with Ukraine.
Precisely. By May, the Hungarian government alters its own constitution so that a war occurring entirely outside of Hungary's borders can trigger dictatorial emergency powers inside Hungary.
The timing of this maneuver is the ultimate smoking gun of the entire file. Walk me through the exact dates of how they swapped these crises.
It was a perfectly seamless, instantaneous transition. On May 24, 2022, the government officially terminated the COVID-19 state of danger. Literally on the exact same day, they declared a brand new state of danger based on the war in Ukraine.
You're kidding.
One emergency closed, the other immediately opened, and the extraordinary power of the executive to bypass parliament and rule by decree remained completely 100% uninterrupted.
It is breathtaking. They have essentially engineered a permanent legal loophole where, as long as something bad is happening somewhere in the general vicinity of Eastern Europe, the Hungarian prime minister never has to bother with the legislative process again.
Right.
It's a continuous, unbroken chain of executive rule spanning half a decade. First it was migrants, then a virus, now a war next door.
And just as they did with the pandemic, they have continued to pass decrees under the Ukraine emergency that have absolutely nothing to do with the war, including further alterations to the justice system and aggressive interventions into the domestic business environment. The architecture of the exception has completely swallowed the architecture of the norm. The rubber band is gone.
Okay, I need to take a breath and act as the skeptic here. Listening to the details of France and Hungary is horrifying. But these are individual nation states.
Yeah.
They are subject to domestic political pressures.
Sure.
Surely the European Union, the supranational guardian of human rights, the ultimate arbiter of the rule of law on the continent, an institution that literally won the Nobel Peace Prize for uniting democracies, surely the EU is stepping in to stop this.
Wow.
I mean, they have courts, they have treaties. The EU exists precisely to prevent member states from backsliding into authoritarianism.
I completely understand that instinct. It's the logical assumption of how the European project is supposed to work. But the deep dive into the legal text reveals a much darker, much more systemic reality. The European Union isn't the hero riding to the rescue in this narrative. The EU is Exhibit C.
You are saying the supranational body designed to protect human rights is actively complicit in the Ratchet effect.
I am saying the evidence shows that when faced with its own institutional crises, the EU has engaged in the exact same pattern of expanded legality, technocratic overreach, and the normalization of emergency measures. They haven't stopped the ratchet, they have codified it into European law. To prove this, we have to examine the death of Schengen.
The Schengen area. For listeners who might not be intimately familiar with the mechanics of European travel, the Schengen Borders Code is the crown jewel of European integration.
It really is.
Specifically, Article 22 guarantees the complete absence of internal border controls between participating countries. It means you can drive a truck from Lisbon, Portugal, all the way to Berlin, Germany, without ever once being stopped by a border guard or showing a passport.
Yeah.
It is the physical, economic, and psychological manifestation of a united, borderless Europe.
That was the foundational dream. But the legal reality since 2015 has been a systematic, localized dismantling of that core principle.
Let's look at the raw numbers from the sources because they are staggering. Since the 2015 migration crisis, member states have unilaterally reintroduced internal border controls over 250 times.
Over 250 notifications of border closures. Member states have utilized a rotating carousel of justifications: the migration crisis, the threat of terrorism, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the geopolitical fallout of the war in Ukraine.
It's the crucifixion strategy again.
Exactly. Just like Hungary's shell game, states like France, Austria, Germany, and Denmark have continuously renewed these supposedly temporary border checks, making them a permanent fixture of European travel.
But wait, the Schengen Borders Code is a binding legal treaty. It has strict statutory limits. You cannot just close your border forever because you feel like it.
Under the rules that existed from 2016 onward, a state could reintroduce internal border controls for a maximum of 6 months for foreseeable threats. In highly specific, exceptional circumstances where the overall functioning of the Schengen area was at risk, the European Council could approve extensions up to 2 years.
So there was a hard limit.
But the member states were blatantly ignoring these limits. They would hit the 6-month legal wall, suddenly claim there was a new threat, for instance, shifting the justification seamlessly from migration to terrorism, and simply restart the 6-month clock.
They were openly mocking the legal framework. Which brings us to a moment in the source material that actually looked, for a brief second, like a massive victory for the rule of law, the NW case.
Yes, the case of NW v. Landespolizei Direction Steiermark. This is a critical legal battleground. It reached the highest authority, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the CJEU.
Let's break down the facts of this case. Who is NW and what were they arguing?
NW is a European citizen who was subjected to a passport control check by Austrian police while trying to cross the internal border from Slovenia into Austria in 2019. Austria had been continuously renewing its border controls with Slovenia since the 2015 migration crisis, blowing way past the legal time limits.
Okay.
NW challenged the legality of this check in court, arguing that Austria's endless extensions violated the Schengen Borders Code. The case escalated all the way to the CJEU.
And in 2022, the Court of Justice delivered its ruling. What did the highest judges in Europe decide?
They delivered a definitive, unambiguous ruling. The CJEU stated that a member state absolutely cannot prolong internal border controls beyond the 6-month maximum limit unless there is a genuinely new, distinct, and serious threat. You cannot just endlessly recycle the same justification. The court essentially looked at the member state's shell game of threats and declared it illegal.
So the highest court in Europe said, no, stop playing games. You are violating the foundational treaty of the European Union. The border controls are illegal. Tear them down. That should be the end of the story. The rule of law prevails.
Right, that's what you'd expect.
So what happened? Did Austria, France, and Germany comply and open their borders?
They completely ignored the ruling. The illegal border controls remained in place. And this brings us to the ultimate smoking gun for Exhibit C. Because faced with powerful member states openly defying the Supreme Court of the Union, the European Union didn't enforce the ruling.
What did they do?
Instead, they chose to change the law to make the illegal practices perfectly legal.
They couldn't hit the target, so the EU moved the goalposts. That is an astonishing capitulation.
In May 2024, the EU officially adopted a massive structural reform to the Schengen Borders Code. And the detailed analysis of this reform provided by scholars and human rights organizations like PICUM reveals a terrifying example of supranational emergency creep.
Let's put this 2024 reform on the autopsy table. What exact legal wording did they change?
First, they explicitly legalized the endless extensions the court had just struck down. Under the newly written code, member states are now legally permitted to unilaterally extend border controls up to 2 years. And if they claim an exceptional threat persists, they can extend them up to 3 years.
Wow.
But the most destructive clause is hidden deeper. The reform states that the Council can now recommend reintroducing border controls ad infinitum, literally forever, as a last resort.
So the concept of a temporary exception to free movement has been legally erased. Permanent border controls inside Europe are now codified law. But the sources highlight an even darker, much more visceral mechanism hidden within this reform. It's a procedure called internal transfers.
This is where the Schengen reform shifts from merely undermining the economic principle of free movement to actively, violently violating fundamental human rights. The new code introduces a fast-track procedure for dealing with undocumented migrants apprehended near an internal border.
The 30-kilometer rule. Walk us through a real-world scenario of how this functions mechanically.
Under the 2024 reform, a border area is defined as extending up to 30 kilometers inland from the actual physical border. If the police apprehend an individual within this massive 30-kilometer zone and determine they do not have the legal right to stay, the member state can immediately transfer that person back to the neighboring EU state they're assumed to have crossed from.
And they are legally authorized to execute this transfer within 24 hours.
A 24-hour turnaround.
Think about the logistics of that. If I'm grabbed by the police 29 kilometers inside Germany, they can process me and throw me back into Austria within a single day. That is an astonishingly fast administrative conveyor belt.
It is incredibly fast for one specific reason. The process involves absolutely no individual judicial assessment. There is no hearing before a judge. There is no time to contact a lawyer. There is no meaningful examination of whether this person is actively seeking asylum, whether they are a victim of human trafficking, or whether returning them violates the absolute bedrock principle of international refugee law, which is non-refoulement. The strict prohibition on returning a refugee to a place where they may face persecution or danger.
The legal analysts from PICUM call this exact procedure exactly what it is: the legalization of internal pushbacks. It allows border police to physically grab a human being, arbitrarily assume their trajectory, and expel them across a border without an ounce of due process.
Yeah.
And this raises an incredibly disturbing logistical question. If there are no physical border checkpoints anymore, how do the police decide who to stop and interrogate within this massive 30-kilometer inland zone?
That is the most insidious structural flaw. The EU fundamentally relies on the member states' national police forces to enforce these internal transfers. And how do police officers identify undocumented migrants walking down a street or sitting on a train 20 kilometers from the border? They rely on visual cues. The 2024 reform essentially provides a vast, shielded legal framework that actively encourages and legitimizes widespread racial profiling. If you do not look traditionally European, you are exponentially more likely to be stopped, questioned, and subjected to this 24-hour expedited transfer process.
Wait, the European Commission is known as the guardian of the treaties. It's the executive branch of the EU, explicitly responsible for protecting the fundamental rights of people within the Union and ensuring member states obey the law. Why did the Commission surrender?
Because of politics.
But why didn't they initiate infringement procedures lawsuits against Austria or France for breaking the original rules? Why cave in, ignore the court, and rewrite the entire code to legalize racial profiling and pushbacks?
The academic literature defines this institutional cowardice with a specific term: supranational forbearance.
Supranational forbearance. That sounds like a highly sanitized academic way of saying looking the other way because you were scared.
It is exactly that. The EU has undergone a profound institutional mutation over the last decade of overlapping crises. It was originally founded as a rigid legal framework designed to protect rights, enforce treaties, and ensure peace through economic integration. The law was supreme, but the sources argue it has devolved into a functionalist, technocratic regime.
Break down the difference. What does a technocratic regime prioritize over the law?
A technocratic regime prioritizes its own survival. The primary goal of the EU institutions is no longer upholding the purity and enforcement of the legal order. The primary goal is simply keeping the massive political machine running and preventing the total collapse of the Union.
So they compromise.
The European Commission made a calculated political decision. They knew that if they took hard, punitive legal action against powerful, influential member states like France or Germany over internal border controls, it would spark a catastrophic political crisis.
Right, because right-wing populist movements across Europe would have weaponized the lawsuit, claiming the unelected bureaucrats in Brussels were forcing sovereign nations to keep their borders open to terrorists and migrants.
So, to save the political unity of the European Union, the Commission voluntarily sacrificed the foundational legal principles of the European Union. They traded the human rights of the individual migrant and the legal certainty of the Schengen Treaty to appease the political anxieties of the most powerful member states.
They chose political appeasement over legal enforcement.
Exactly. And the 2024 reform proves it by removing a critical oversight mechanism. Under the old rules, if a state wanted to close its borders, the Commission had a strict, mandatory requirement to issue a formal legal opinion on whether the closure was justified.
And the new reform.
The 2024 reform entirely removed that mandatory requirement. The Commission gave up its own power to oversee the process. They replaced strict legal enforcement with soft enforcement. They established consultations.
Meaning what, practically?
They've essentially engineered a gentleman's agreement framework where the member states and the Commission agree to politely sit around a table and discuss the fact that they're violating the spirit of Schengen while legally authorizing them to continue doing it forever.
Okay, we need to pull all of these threads together.
Yeah.
We are standing over the autopsy table. We have meticulously examined the 3 smoking guns. Exhibit A, France taking a brutal 1955 colonial war statute and using it to permanently embed warrantless raids and pre-crime house arrests into its everyday administrative security code via the SILT law.
Right.
Exhibit B, Hungary utilizing a respiratory virus to grant its executive the permanent, rolling power to rule by decree, defund opponents, and rewrite the Constitution without parliamentary debate.
And Exhibit C.
The European Union openly ignoring its own Supreme Court, rewriting its foundational treaties to legalize racial profiling and endless border closures simply because it lacks the political courage to enforce its own laws.
This raises an important question. When we step back and synthesize this mountain of evidence, what is the ultimate cause of death for these democratic norms? What is the underlying shared structural vulnerability that allowed the Ratchet effect to operate so flawlessly across a national republic, an illiberal democracy, and a supranational union?
You're the lead pathologist here. What is the final diagnosis? What killed the rule of law?
The fatal vulnerability across every single case study is the deliberate erosion of legal certainty through the weaponization of incredibly vague definitions.
Words matter. The entire system relies on vocabulary.
In law, vocabulary is the only thing that separates state power from state violence. When you look closely at France, Hungary, and the EU, they all rely on aggressively elastic terminology to execute their power grabs. In France, the Silt law allows the restriction of liberties based on purely subjective definitions of what constitutes a threat to public order.
Just a threat to public order.
Right. In Hungary, the dictatorial power to rule by decree is triggered by the nebulous, highly manipulatable concepts of a state of danger or fear-mongering.
And at the supranational level, the EU Schengen reform legally justifies sealing internal borders due to the instrumentalization of migrants.
Precisely. Who gets to legally define instrumentalization? Who holds the power to define a security threat? The executive branch does. When the definitions of a crisis are purposely kept broad and undefined, the law can be applied arbitrarily to anyone the executive chooses.
Which brings us directly to the most critical part of this investigation. Why you, the listener, need to understand this. You might be listening to this deep dive on your commute, or while washing dishes and thinking, okay, this is an incredibly fascinating, high-level legal theory discussion, but I'm not a suspected terrorist living in Paris. I'm not a political opposition mayor in Budapest. And I'm not an undocumented migrant trying to cross the Austrian border in the middle of the night.
Right. Why should I care?
Exactly. Why does this intricate legal erosion actually matter to me?
It matters fundamentally because of the insidious normalization of pre-crime logic. When definitions of threats become vague, and when the vital checks and balances, specifically the requirement for prior judicial review, are legislated out of existence, the net inevitably widens.
The warped rubber band eventually stretches to include you.
Yes. When the state grants itself the legal authority to act on suspicion rather than hard evidence, any citizen, any climate activist, any marginalized community, or even a local business owner who inadvertently runs afoul of the government's current political agenda can easily be caught in the web of administrative restrictions.
You no longer have to actually commit a crime to have your life, your privacy, or your movement dismantled.
No, you simply have to be deemed a potential risk by an unaccountable, faceless bureaucrat utilizing a secret white note. The sources clearly warn that this creates a hyper-securitized society where the paralyzing fear of a hypothetical threat completely outweighs the absolute guarantee of fairness, due process, and liberty.
It is the ultimate systemic failure. The architecture of the exception has successfully become the architecture of the norm. But before we close the file, the academic sources point out one final, massive structural flaw, specifically at the European Union level, right? A legal phenomenon they call the conferral trap. Explain this, because it shows how deep rot goes.
The conferral trap is unique to the EU. The European Union, unlike a sovereign nation-state like France or Germany, does not have a traditional constitution with a clearly defined, democratically debated emergency powers clause. The EU only possesses the specific, limited powers that the member states have explicitly conferred or granted upon it through treaties.
Okay, so they're structurally limited.
So when a massive, unprecedented crisis hits like the COVID-19 pandemic, the EU institutions find themselves lacking a proper, legally sound, democratic constitutional framework to respond quickly.
So lacking the legal tools, what do? They cheat the system.
They drastically stretch their conferred powers to the absolute breaking point, utilizing obscure treaty articles to bypass democratic procedure. The prime documented example in our sources is the creation of HRA during the pandemic.
HRA, the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority.
Yes. Now, normally, if the EU wants to create a powerful new regulatory agency to handle health emergencies, it would establish an independent agency like the European Medicines Agency. That process requires legislation, public debate, and crucially, it would be subject to strict oversight by the European Parliament.
But the European Commission didn't want to wait for the messy, slow legislative process.
They claimed the emergency demanded unprecedented speed, so they utilized a legal loophole. They created HRA not as an independent agency, but as an internal executive service of the Commission itself.
Oh.
They concentrated massive funding and regulatory power entirely within the executive branch, completely and intentionally cutting the European Parliament, which is the only directly elected body in the entire EU, the only true democratic voice of the citizens, out of the equation entirely.
It is technocratic governance on steroids. The unelected experts and the executives retreat into a closed room, make the rules, allocate the billions in funding, and claim the crisis demands speed over democracy.
And the profound danger is that once that anti-democratic precedent is set and accepted, it becomes the new blueprint for how the EU will handle every subsequent crisis. Whether it's climate change, energy shortages, or the next pandemic, the democratic legislature is permanently sidelined.
Let's wrap up this deep dive. We've traveled through a decade of legal manipulation. We have seen the Ratchet effect operating in its pure, terrifying form. From the resurrected ghosts of colonial war laws being used to raid homes in modern France, to the endless, shape-shifting shell game of emergencies allowing a prime minister to rewrite a constitution in Hungary.
And the European Union quietly rewriting its foundational treaties to legalize its own member states' violations just to keep the political peace.
The evidence compiled by these human rights organizations and legal scholars is overwhelming and undeniable. Across the European continent, the concept of a temporary suspension of the legal order has been meticulously engineered into a permanent expansion of executive authority.
The exception is the rule.
We started this hour in the autopsy room, looking at the cold, hard, documented facts of how a legal system is quietly dismantled from the inside out. And I want to leave you with a final, chilling idea to mull over as you go about your day.
That's an important one.
We established at the very beginning that emergency powers under international law are theoretically designed to protect the state so it can eventually return to normal. But we've just spent this entire investigation proving that our governments have spent the last 10 years aggressively redesigning the legal system so that emergency is the new normal.
The rubber band is permanently warped.
The severe tools of exception are now the mundane tools of everyday governance. So here's the question you have to ask yourself. What exactly is going to happen, and what horrifying new powers will these executives claim when the next truly unprecedented global crisis hits?
Yeah, what's left to take?
If warrantless searches based on anonymous suspicion, ruling by decree without parliamentary debate, and legalized racial profiling at borders are just what happens on a random Tuesday now, have we already given them the keys to the kingdom? When the next massive fire starts, will there be any rights left to suspend? Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into the sources. We hope this investigation gives you a sharper, more critical lens through which to view the daily headlines. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and always read the fine print.